Welcome to the unit Dyeing Techniques. This unit introduces skills needed for the purpose of dyeing. Students will learn dyeing techniques through a combination of textual content and drawings. This unit comprises of 3 modules and a final assignment section that invites you to reflect on what you have learned. By the end of this unit, students will be able to identify the materials and tools required for dyeing, describe the tie-dye techniques, describe the batik techniques. The first module introduces the different dyeing techniques. The first section explains the different techniques of dyeing. Dye is a natural or synthetic substance used to add a color to or change the color of something. According to Webster's dictionary, dyeing is the process of coloring fibers, yarns or fabrics by using a liquid containing coloring matter for imparting a particular hue to a substance. Dyeing is achieved in a solution containing dyestuffs, and the significant factors involved are temperature and time control. There are mainly 2 classes of dyes, natural and synthetic. During the process of dyeing, a chemical bonding is formed between the dye molecules and the fiber molecules. The primary source of dyes historically has been the nature wherein the dyes have been extracted from animals, plants and minerals. Since the mid-18th century, humans have produced artificial dyes to achieve a wider range of colors and make the dyes stable to washing and general use. Dyes used by the textile industry are largely synthetic, typically derived from coal tar and petroleum-based intermediates. Textiles are dyed using a wide range of dye stuff, techniques and equipments. Different classes of dyes are used for different types of fibers and at different stages of the textile production processes, from loose fibers to yarns, fabrics and completed garments. Dyes are available as powders, granules, paste and liquid dispersions. There are 4 main stages of dyeing. In the fiber stage, both natural and man-made fibers can be dyed at this stage. It enables dyeing to be uniform. However, there is a lot of wastage during further processing of fiber. During the yarn stage, yarns are dyed, especially when they have to be sold as such. Hence, in embroidery threads, sewing threads, knitting yarns, yarn-dyed fabrics, dyeing is done at the yarn stage. In the fabric stage, most of the fabrics that are dyed in a single solid color are dyed at this stage. This method is fast and is easy to match colors. Blended fabrics can also be dyed. During the garment dyeing stage, sometimes after stitching of the garment, there are requirements to dye it. Fiber content determines the type of dye required for a specific fabric. Examples of cellulosic fibers are cotton, linen, jute, hemp, ramie, bamboo and rayon. Cellulosic fibers require fiber-reactive, direct or substantive and wet dyes, which are colorless, soluble dyes fixed by light and or oxygen. Examples of protein fiber are wool, angora, mohair, cashmere, silk, soy, leather and suede. Protein fibers require vat, acid or indirect or modern dyes that require a bonding agent. Examples of synthetic fibers are nylon, acrylic, polyester and polypropylene. Each synthetic fibers require its own dyeing method. For example, nylon requires acid, disperse and pigment dyes, while rayon acetate requires dispersed dyes. Resist dyeing is a widely used method of applying colors or patterns to the fabric, which involves dyeing only selected parts of a piece of fabric. A substance that is impervious to the dye blocks access to certain areas of the fabric, while other parts are free to take up the dye color. Resist can be applied through threads or similar materials, clamping, stitching, mud, wax or starch. Tie-dye and batik are some of the examples of simplest dye resist techniques which have been widely used traditionally in various parts of the world. Both the techniques have been covered in this unit. Tie-dye involves pinching areas of cloth and tying them tightly with thread before dyeing. Removal of thread reveals small circular marks in the original fabric color. Complex patterns can then be built up by repeating the process using another dye color. The various tie-dye techniques that are practiced in the world are Bandhani, Lehariya, Mothra in India, Plangi in Indonesia, Tritik in Indonesia and West Africa, and Shibori in Japan. In Japan, rice is used as the resist. This technique is called susugaki. In Java, wax is used and is called batik. Originally, the hot wax was applied with a shape strip of bamboo, but in the 17th century, the invention of the janting, a copper crucible with spouts of different sizes, meant that the wax could more easily be applied in continuous lines of various thickness, thus improving the fineness of the patterns that could be attempted. The earliest batik were in monochrome patterns against an indigo background, but multicolored ones were produced from the 18th century onwards using methods learnt from expert Muslim dyers in India. Typical patterns represented ancient symbolic designs in complex, symmetrical, intertwining layouts and reflected the social class of the owner through their levels of intricacy. Some of the ceremonial garments produced and decorated in this way are amongst the most superb example of textile ornamentation known. In India, beeswax resist was used for part of the fabric coloring process in the production of chintz. Charcoal or other fugitive color materials was used to transfer the pattern onto the cotton cloth. A porous bag of loose charcoal powder called a pounce was dusted over a design pricked onto paper. Then the hot wax was drawn on with a reed pen following the charcoal guidelines. The textile workers were largely low-caste Hindu family groups, each family skilled in a separate stage of the complex chintz making process and working in their own small crafts workshop. In batik, resist is obtained by applying wax on fabric as per a predetermined pattern and is known by the same term. After dyeing and removal of the wax, the pattern is revealed in the original fabric color. This process can be repeated several times to obtain various hues and shades of color. Flowering trees appear to spring out from a dense background composed of a diamond grid with a lar or Garuda wings placed within each diamond. The Kipala is composed of diamonds and triangular forms filled with floral patterns. In this section, you will learn about the various materials and tools needed for different dyeing techniques. These are the materials required for tie and dye. Bleached cotton fabrics such as malmal or muslin, cambric or poplin, cotton or polyester thread for tying, plastic sheet for design tracing, fugitive color for design transfer, pin or needle for marking holes in design sheet, direct dyes, water, thread or cord for tying, stitching needle, steel or wooden clamps for resisting, sodium chloride or common salt or sodium sulfate, small jugs or containers to make dye paste, glass or plastic measuring cylinders, measuring spoons, weighing scale, steel tumblers, steel, wooden, glass rod for stirring, burner, rubber gloves, scissors, steam iron and a face mask. These are the materials required for batik printing. Bleached and scoured cotton cloth, natural wax, paraffin wax, frame to stretch the fabric, masking tape or dressmaker's pins, brush or block to apply. These are the materials required for dyeing and removing wax. Naphthol dyes, diazosols, turkey red oil, caustic soda, tubs and buckets, water, weighing scale, small jug or container to make dye paste, plastic cups, glass or plastic measuring cylinders, measuring spoons, glass, stainless steel or fiberglass rods to stir dyes, rubber gloves, soap, face mask, detergent and electric iron. Now, let us move on and learn the process of tie-dye. Follow these steps to tie-dye. Transfer the design to stiff plastic and pierce the pattern with a thick needle. The holes should not be too close. Put the plastic over the prepared cloth and lightly mark through the holes with a soluble marker. To make the resist, pinch up a little pieces of cloth and bind it tightly with heavy thread. Create different patterns by changing the space of tying. The thread has to be wound and tied tightly to prevent dye penetration. The thread can be carried over to the next knot rather than needing it to be cut after each binding. If the thread is tied around only the cloth, a tiny spot of color remains in the center, resulting in a circle. If a small object such as a pebble or a bean is tied up in the cloth, the center is much bigger. Do not tie all the dots in one go. leave some of the tying and dyeing with subsequent colors. This is an example of single tying. This is an example of double tying at separate intervals. This is an example of multiple tying at separate intervals. Alternately, the cloth can be folded and tied, a tie-dyeing method used in India for turban cloths known as lahariya. Fine cloths such as muslins can be folded in a concentric manner and tied tightly at intervals. It is dipped quickly in dye of a pale color. Some areas are then unrolled and the process is repeated with progressively darker dyes to build up a range of colors in stripes. The images here show resin stitch in place and drawing together on the thread. This technique can be used for many effects. Fold the fabric in half and draw shapes as desired with a pencil or chalk and stitch around the shapes in running stitch. Then pull the threads together as tight as possible before fastening. Tie stones or large beans into the fabrics for circles. Alternately, for larger or smaller effects, try coins, chickpeas, rice or even shells. Use thread to secure and tie the fabric in place. Refer to the images on how this can be done. Mark random points on the fabric with your pencil or chalk. Pick up these marked points and tie a knot in the fabric at that point. You can refer to the images on this how this can be done. Crumple the fabric in your hand and bind it into a tight hard ball. For each color, crumple the fabric in different places for a random effect. For a large garment, bunch along the length, section by section for a long, firm roll. Crumple the fabric in the hand and bind it into a tight hard ball for each color. Crumple the fabric in different places for a random effect. For a large garment, bunch along a length section by section for a long, firm roll. Displayed here is an example of resist pattern by folding technique. Knotting can be done by tying a length of fabric with equally spaced knots along it. Twist the fabric lightly so that it coils back on itself. Bind it at the ends and at intervals along the coiled fabric. Dye the cloth by first using the palest color. Dye can be mixed in the same way or as for applied resist dyeing. The fabric should not be left too long in the dye to prevent color penetration through the threads. Rinse and dry the fabric and then tie more knots to reserve areas for the second knot. Knots already tied should not be untied. Dye the fabric again with the next palest color. The process of tying and dyeing can be repeated often provided dye colors go from light to dark. Rinse and dry after each dyeing. After the last dye, untie all the twists of the threads, wash the fabric in detergent and press firmly. This is tie-dyed fabric in multiple colors. This is another picture of tie-dyed fabric in multiple colors. For the dyeing process, the minimum material to liquor ratio is 1:30. The liquor refers to the total volume of solution of dye stuff dissolved in water. To prepare the stock solution, accurately weigh 2 grams of dye stuff. Paste it thoroughly using water. Add small amounts of hot water to the paste and dissolve it completely. If necessary, the solution can be heated until it becomes clear. Dilute the solution to 100 ml with cold water. This solution is called 2% stock solution. From this solution, pipe out the calculate amount of dye solution. The calculations for the amount of stock solution and the amount of water that is required are displayed here. Weight of the fabric into shade percentage, amount of stock solution required in ml equals to percentage of stock solution. Amount of water required equals to weight of fabric into ml ratio, amount of stock solution required. To dye a fabric, take desize scoured and bleached cotton yarn or fabric of 20 cm by 20 cm size. Tie the fabric by any one of the methods covered in the course, that is folding, pleating, spiraling, twisting, coiling, marbling, simple tying or threading. Immerse it in water bath for 10 minutes. Prepare the stock solution separately. Take the calculated amount of stock solution. Add it into the water bath. Maintain the material to liquor ratio at 1:30. Slowly raise the temperature of the water bath up to 90 degrees centigrade. Stir the dye color continuously for 20 minutes. Add the calculated amount of sodium chloride to the dye bath. Increase the temperature up to boiling point. Continue dyeing for another 20 minutes. Add another calculated amount of sodium chloride solution to the dye bath. At the end of the dyeing process, take the fabric out of the dye bath, squeeze and rinse it in running water. Repeat the entire procedure to add the next color. For targeting various effects, one may explore the time of exposure and position of the dipping in dye bath. Soak the fabric or yarn in presence of 3 grams per liter of a soap solution and 2 grams per liter of soda ash. Rinse the fabric in cold water and open the fabrics to see the effects of the dyeing and keep it for drying. After drying of the fabric, iron the fabric and mount it with a description of the dyeing techniques. Now that we have seen process of tie-dye, let us look at the process of creating batik. The cloth needs to be washed to remove any starch or finishes. Next, the fabric may be cut to the required dimensions, keeping in mind the small allowance of 5 to 7 cm for pinning the fabric to the frame. The material should be stretched as taut as possible to ensure the accurate application of wax. If a frame is not being used, then the fabric must be made smooth and flat and should be laid on a sheet of grease-proof paper. There are a number of ways to transfer the design onto the fabric. The chosen design may be traced with a soft pencil or dissolvable marker on the material with the help of a tracing sheet. If the material is sheer or transparent, the design may be traced directly or by placing the material over the design on a light colored surface. The design appears clearly through the fabric and can be traced with a soft pencil. The process of applying wax to the fabric. Newspapers or plastic sheets must cover the work surface before starting the wax application. Paraffin wax and beeswax may be mixed in a ratio of 60:40 to achieve a good quality of resist in the fabric. This mixture needs to be heated in a utensil. The wax should be heated slowly till it gains a flowing consistency like that of a water. To test whether the wax is ready to be applied, a small drop of the molten wax may be dripped onto the edge of a fabric. If it looks transparent, it means the wax is ready. On the other hand, if the wax looks opaque on the fabric, then it needs more heating. The heating of the wax should be continued at a lower temperature to avoid solidification. The wax may be applied by a nylon bristle brush, starting with the areas that needs to be kept white. After the first dyeing, the wax may be applied further to the areas that need to retain the first dye color. Wooden and metal blocks may also be used to apply wax. In Indonesia, a special tool called canting is used to apply wax onto the fabric to create intricate batik patterns. The back of the cloth has to be checked from time to time to ensure that the wax has penetrated the cloth, and wherever required, the cloth may be re-waxed from the back side too. It is quite difficult to remove the wax once applied. Therefore, one needs to be careful during the process of application of the wax. To remove any unwanted area, the wax has to be scraped gently with a knife from both sides of the fabric, followed by rubbing a metal spoon that has been immersed in boiling water. The treatment may be repeated until all the wax is removed. The fabric resisted through wax in batik is dyed in naphthol or azoic dyes, which are called cold dyes. Since they are neither involved in heating of the dye bath or the process of dyeing, nor do they require any heat or steam fixing. Naphthal dyes require immersion in two different sets of baths which should not be mixed together. The first bath is the naphthal bath to saturate the fiber. To this bath, an alkali is added, usually caustic soda, to make the dye solution. The second bath contains the color salts called the diazo salts that instantly develop the color on the fabric on reaction with the naphthol. Naphthal dyes have coded letters as suffix to their names. The colors achieved in dyeing depends on the combination of the particular naphthol with the particular salt. Thus, one naphthol base can be used with different salts to yield different colors and vice versa. The displayed table lists some of the common colors achievable through the combination of naphthol and salts. The displayed table lists some common colors achievable through the combination of naphthol and salts. This table gives the standard recipe for the dye bath for 1 liter of water. To make the alkali solution, measure 441 grams of sodium hydroxide, which is caustic soda, and add it to 1 liter of cold water. Stir until it dissolves. This solution can be stored and used repeatedly. The solution should be labeled carefully and direct skin contact should be avoided. To make the naphthol bath, take 2 grams of naphthol in a plastic or glass jug. Mix a paste of the naphthol by adding a little TRO. Add 250 ml of boiling water to dissolve the powder. Immediately add 5 ml of alkali solution, 1 drop at a time, until the naphthol is clear and yellow. If the naphthol does not clear, the solution should be reheated and stirred. Dilute the solution to 100 ml. Cool the naphthol for 5 minutes and then add sufficient cold water to make up to 1 liter. This bath should be kept away from direct sunlight. To mix the diazo salt bath. For a medium dye shade, measure 4 grams of azo salt powder. Mix it into a paste with little cold water. Add enough cold water to make it up to 1 liter. For dyeing, one needs to ensure that the dye bath is wide enough to submerge and move the waxed cloth. The waxed cloth may be gently immersed in the dye bath, keeping it as flat as possible to avoid the development of cracks at this stage. If fine lines are deliberately required, then the fabric should be gently crumpled to get the effect. This creates small cracks through which a little amount of dye color penetrates the design and yields fine cracks in it. To dye, take the dye-sized, scoured and bleached cotton fabric on which wax is applied. Put the rubber gloves and immerse the fabric in naphthol solution. Run the fabric gently in solution for 5 minutes. Lift the cloth and allow the drips to fall back into the bath. Hang the fabric for 10 minutes away from natural sunlight. Any naphthol that drips into the diazo salt bath exhausts it. Place the sample for developing the color in the salt bath. Next, agitate a little and keep it in the bath for 5 minutes. Run it through the base solution for 20 minutes. Take the material out and hang for a while. Do not squeeze the fabric and rinse the fabric in cold water. The dye shade looks darker in wet fabric. To get a better idea, the same should be held up against the light to view the actual shade. The Naphthal dye colors can also be developed on a localized area using the following method. Dip the wax resist fabric into the naphthol and alkali bath and then allow it to dry completely in air, avoiding direct sunlight. Mix a concentrated diazo salt solution and use it to paint with sponge or spray onto the fabric. Dry it completely by hanging in the shade. The fabric may now be washed using the method described to remove the wax. Repeat the dye process in the appropriate naphthol and diazo salt baths to develop the next color before protecting the previous shade with application of wax. Further waxing may be done after the cloth dries. Some waxed areas may also need rewaxing if they are put through several dyeing cycles. These diagrams illustrate the dyeing sequence of colors from light to dark and the waxing of areas for a fish motif. Dyeing the cloth in the first color, which is yellow, after the application of wax on the areas that have to be kept white. Dyeing of the cloth in the second color, that is the red color, after the application of wax on the areas that have to be kept yellow. Dyeing of the cloth in a third color, indigo blue, after the application of wax on the areas that have to be kept red. This is the final look of the design on the fabric after removal of wax. The first dyeing gave yellow, the second gave the red, and the last dyeing gave the reddish purple due to over dyeing of the red areas with blue. The two main processes to remove the wax from the fabric are boiling and ironing. In boiling, the wax flakes may be removed as far as possible from the fabric. Next, the fabric may be completely immersed in a large pan fully filled with hot water, which should then be made to boil for 2 to 3 minutes. The fabric should then be transferred to a bucket of cold water. This solidifies a lot of wax, which may be later removed by a strainer. The boiling process should be repeated again, but with only 1 minute of boiling. The process may be repeated for heavily waxed fabrics. Finally, the fabric should be boiled in water containing detergent, followed by rinsing to remove all the last traces of wax. In ironing, the flaking off should be done as described before. Next, the fabric should be placed between layers of absorbent paper on several sheets of newspaper. The fabric should be ironed properly, constantly changing the newspaper as it gets saturated with wax. Any dye left on the surface of the fabric must be wiped off before ironing. This may continue until all the wax is removed. A final boil in hot water with detergent or treatment by a liquid solvent may be necessary if wax marks remain. All the wax collected as flakes and sieved from the boiling may be recycled and used in future batik applications. The collected wax may be boiled in water to remove any dye color or impurity and cooled off to get an upper layer of solidified wax. To summarize, in this unit, you have learned about the tie-dye and batik methods of dyeing. Thank you.